Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
So let's talk about muscles. What is the relationship between muscles and your mental direction and orders? Do we direct muscles directly, or are muscles part of some other bigger, more whole system?
Yes. Well, I wanted to discuss this question today with you because I've had many questions recently. I don't know, it's the spring here, and people ask questions about muscles, about directing muscles. And so I thought that I could make a little break because we were discussing the control of human habitual reaction and discussing models of new equilibrium, how equilibrium was very, very much related with our coordinating principles, the coordinating principles Alexander has constructed. And these questions about muscles are related with this question because I think that it's a very habitual reaction to start and think that the Alexander technique is about, well, directing the mind toward the muscles. Because, well, in Alexander's books, it's clear that Alexander has a very light use of words. He is not very clear about definitions when he is talking about movements. Most of the time he uses the word muscles because for him, well, the muscles are related to movements. But how are they related to movements and how do we direct them in practice? You will find that very often the habitual idea of directing muscle clashes with the coordinating principles we are using. So there was this question, and I want to present the question so that people start to have an idea of what we are talking about. A question recently on a media platform where I sometimes answer, sometimes do not. And I thought that this one was quite interesting. I could show in detail more than just a quick answer what we are discussing. So there is a teacher, and many of my students are Alexander teachers. So that is why this question is asked in this way. A lay person would never ask a question in this way. So the person was puzzled about the origin and insertions of muscles. If you look into an anatomy book, you will find that muscles are defined by how many fascicles they've got and where they insert. And so very often there is this idea that there is an origin and an insertion, with the idea that the origin is the fixed part and the insertion is the moving part. And very many problems are, well, coming from this source, from this representation. That is, of course, something people imagine. There is no origin or insertion in the body that you could define or look at. If you want, there is one massive part that is fundamental in equilibrium. You would call it the mechanism of the torso. So as the mechanism of the torso is, for example, 9 times heavier than the head, you would think that it's not the head that is moving the torso most of the time. It's impossible to imagine that such a small weight could have a dramatic action on the equilibrium of the torso above the ankle. It's just a question of reasoning and of sound ideas about the mechanics of the mechanism we are considering. So do I take seriously this idea of origin insertion? Not really, but this is not the real problem. The real problem is the question that the person is asking in the second paragraph, where she says, do you think an insertion, origin insertion, is relevant, or is it a factor one should consider in which way to direct muscles? And that is a a very normal habitual reaction for a person that has been trained with the somatic technique. They have this idea that direction, giving orders, is giving orders to muscles. And so there are many orders to release muscles, but in this case, the person was discussing a serratus anterior muscle, and that serratus anterior muscles, in most people, habitual postural reaction are very, very lax, flaccid, and not promoting the action they should. The serratus anterior is a muscle that is linking the interior part of the scapula with the front ribs. It's a muscle that is very large, that is rotating around the rib cage and coming from the back to the front. And of course, it's got a dual action. And the two actions are more or less equivalent. But one is going to be more visible than the other. So let's start with the visible action. The serratus anterior is considered a protractor of the shoulder. It's a muscle that will make the shoulder move around the rib cage and forward. It's an interesting muscle in the sense that when the shoulder blades are pulled with the shoulder forward and rotating around the rib cage, protracting the shoulder blade. Of course, the shoulder blades are going apart from the spine and they are said to be widening. It's the main means whereby instruction to, for example, Alexander used in the very well-known hands on the back of a chair procedure. He used the idea of pulling the elbows outwards and slightly downwards. And so as the hands are placed on the top of the chair, very far forward, the shoulders has already rotated. There are many pictures showing that Alexander wants the pupil to have the shoulder very far forward and very low relative to the torso. And of course, he's not so much interested in the arm for itself. He's interested in the movement of the arm because of its action on the lengthening of the torso, because the second and not as obvious action of the serratus anterior is to lift the ribs at the front backward and upward. So it's very related with this instruction that you may have heard, that is back, yes. And it's related, of course, to the counteract that will make the protruding abdomen recede backward. If the rib cage is rotated forward and down at its lower part, at the front, you can be certain that the upper chest is going to be unduly lifted backward. Thereby, it's impossible for the upper thoracic spine and the cervical spine to go forward and up. If you want to go forward and up with the cervical spine, of course, it's necessary for the upper thoracic spine to go forward and up, and that requires a new poise of the mechanism of the chest. And so the serratus anterior muscle is, of course, activated in this activity. So the question is, should we consider activating the serratus anterior? And you can ask the question with any muscle you want. For example, I will discuss later a muscle that is easier to represent, which is the psoas group, which is also fundamental to lengthening the torso. And should we use or thinking to activate this muscle with opposite directions? That is the question that is asked in this lesson. And well, to find the answers, it's very simple. You just go into the books, you read what Alexander has to say, or you listen to what he said to his own students. I've taken an example from a conversation with one of his students, so that you can then realize that directing muscles, I mean thinking of opposite direction for same muscle, is completely outside of Alexander's scheme and coordinating principles. we do not think of muscles directions when we think directions. That's my answer, and I will try and develop and explain how this reasoning is constructed. So the first thing is another question about muscles that was asked to Alexander. It's Goddard Binkley. I'm interested in these lessons because, for example, this paragraph I've taken from a lesson that Frederick Matthias Alexander gave to Goddard Binkley in 1953. And this is 2 years before Alexander's death. So it's the end of his life. So I'm interested in these late lessons because they give us an idea of how Alexander, if he did, change his theory from the very beginning, 1910 to 1953. And so here there is a question that is asked to Alexander. It's what about looking at the ceiling? Goddard Binkley considers that the head back is bad and you should not pull your head back. So he's interested in, he's asking the question to Alexander about the muscle of the back of the neck. One main one, the largest one, is the trapezius muscle. And Binkley start to think that it's improper to look at the ceiling. And Alexander demonstrates first with himself. So Alexander stops the lessons before that moment. He stops the lessons and he comes around and he faces Binkley. So you must think this is quite strange to do that during a lesson. It's a very powerful move that Alexander is making. And he explained that when Alexander has to look up, he first lengthens. And so we understand he lengthened the mechanism of the torso. And when the mechanism of the torso is lengthened, he's looking up at the ceiling. And this is obviously surprising to Binkley. And Alexander comes around and starts giving, what is necessary, correct manipulation, you imagine, of the mechanism of the torso, so that when it's lengthened, then Binkley discovers that he can move his head up and down, to the side, anything, without any strain, without any tightening at the back of his neck. And so it's again a demonstration that it's not the relationship between the head and neck that makes the lengthening of the primary control. It's the lengthening of the primary control that allows to move the head in any way we want. So that's why Alexander says, what is important about the muscle for me is their total working together, how they all work together in order to accomplish the lengthening and widening we want to obtain. You see, all the large muscles of the neck are supposed to do is turn the head on its own axis and to tilt the head forwards and backwards and sideways. The trouble comes when we try to do with these muscles in the neck what we want to do and are supposed to do with the muscles of the legs, the arms, and so on. And so we discover here that Alexander is interested in how all the muscles work together. So this is going to be a big part of my answer, because we know that there are 700 muscles in the body, more or less. Each of these muscles has 3 to 10 fascicles, 10 directions of action that are different. And so if you calculate then the number of muscles by the number of fascicles by the, of course, the insertion and origin direction, then if you want to lift the head and direct the torso, well, your estimation is roughly 12,000 directions, which is obviously impossible, obviously crazy. you may direct your mind toward a supposed insertion, a supposed origin of 1, 2 muscles, 3 muscles at the top, but it makes no sense. So we are teaching in the initial Alexander technique, we teach a reason technique. We do not teach like nice analogies or mythological stories that the pupil could grasp somehow because of his a certain somatic intelligence inside his body. No, we do really stick to principles. We really do think that we do not direct muscles directly, ever. Yes, it's not, and it has nothing to do with the technique. Any sort of approach where people are directing tone or tonus or are communicating activation is absolutely, for me, unscientific, unreasoned, and it's certainly not what we are after. And this does not correspond with the reeducation of human reaction. So I've shown you, well, a comment that Alexander made at the end of his life. I want also to show you something he wrote at the very beginning of it, something that you may not know, because this is part of the first edition of Man's Supramental Intense, the first book Alexander wrote, and that was changed quite radically. In well, some chapters disappeared, some chapters were added in 1917. And so this is also interesting to compare the start and the finish and see what Alexander is talking about and where should be our answer to the question of any direction of muscle. So again, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see. So Alexander explained 2 kinds of orders. There is only one part that is presented here. It's part that is concerning orders of definite inhibition. There are 2 kinds of orders Alexander was giving to his pupils, and that the pupil should give herself. These are not orders that the teacher is giving. They are orders for the pupil to use in order to change their own reaction to stimuli. So we have orders concerning definite performance. So Alexander is asking the person to, for example, place the hands on the top of the chair and direct the elbows against the mechanism of the wrist so that a certain angle between the finger, the hand, and the arm could be, in fact, implemented in such a way as to, in fact, support and raise the mechanism of the torso. Alexander explained that if these orders of definite performance are strictly followed by the pupil, he would get a new experience of what it is to organize the mechanism of the torso. And that in this case, a state of minimum tension would be discovered. It's very strange because if you try and place the hands in the way Alexander explains, with the elbow slightly oriented downward and forward, well, first of all, you are really stimulating the serratus anterior to the point that it's painful. You can't do it, but just a minute or even less than a minute. I've seen pupils after doing it, I don't know, of 20 seconds. They were starting to agitate. They became agitated, and they agitated the shoulders and the elbows and the arm with rhythmic movements, as if to exercise the tension. Alexander says this is the state of minimum tension, and the first thing the person wants to do after performing that for less than 20 seconds is to make some strange release movements. Very often people think, especially dancers, and they think that if they agitate their arms, hands, and shoulders, they are releasing the muscles. It's another belief that is quite funny, quite interesting, but has nothing to do at all with directing in the sense used by Alexander. So let's come back. Alexander says, I may briefly explain orders concerning definite inhibitions. Definite inhibition is you will see like a primary use of speech in order to change our habitual reaction to stimulation. So here, in order to explain orders concerning definite inhibition, I want to state that the teacher will have to deal with incorrect movements unconsciously performed. Of course, the teacher has to deal with these movements because as the pupil is performing them unconsciously, the pupil is not aware he's doing these movements. Very often, I use videos in my lessons to show the person what sort of movements are produced when the person is directing a deliberate movement. It's necessary to discover that movements are linked together in sorts of patterns. Alexander never used that term, he used the term coordinations. So there are certain coordinations. When you ask a person to move the hand forward to grasp something, you will find that the person necessarily, without thinking about it, direct the movement of the elbow. The person has a tendency to not reach up with the hand only, but reach up with an acceleration of the elbow, which makes the arm straighten most of the time. And you find that when the hands go forward and up without a due attention of the movement of the trajectory of the elbow, you will find that the person brings the shoulders up as well as the hand upward. So the first thing is when you see an incorrect movement that is performed like this, is to make sure that it's unconscious. So ask the person whether when reaching up with the hands to touch a chair or to touch anything, the wall behind the person, in front of the person during the lesson, I asked if the person is voluntarily reaching up with the elbow. And no. And I asked whether the subject knows that in moving the hand forward, the person has a tendency to bring the shoulder up, thereby shortening the muscles of the neck and making the muscles of the neck quite rigid and tense, so that any movement of the torso is then directly communicated to the head. There is no freedom in the neck when the neck is shortened. So we are very interested to see what is happening when the person is reaching up with the hands. Imagine, I know there are Alexander teachers that are listening to this podcast, and you are going to start again putting hands on people. So when you put hands on people, of course, your hands are reaching forward and upward to touch the person in front of you, to touch the head, for example. And so what is seen happening when the person is reaching forward with the hand? Do we see the neck shorten or not? That means that the person is performing some movements with the shoulders without being aware of it. That's what Alexander, in fact, describes as incorrect movement, unconsciously performed. To make sure it's incorrect, well, first you note that it's shortening the neck. So if you see a person shortening the neck, you must think, if you've read Alexander, that it's a bad idea. But then when you see the person raising the shoulders, there is something else that you will note, is that there is another movement. We were discussing the serratus anterior, but there is a problem with the serratus anterior, is that if you lift the shoulders, you lift, of course, the scapula, and you tend to, in order to do that, you have to release the serratus anterior. Oh, yes, the serratus anterior opposes the movement of the scapula upward. So without doing anything, you just, it's coordinated in your movement, because we see that the scapula is going up in space. We just know that the serratus anterior is, of course, flaccid. It's not transmitting mechanical action. This release is wrong. And so then you discover that when the person is reaching forward with the hand, there is nothing that is preventing the lower rib cage from rotating forward and down. Protruding abdomen is going to appear on screen, and you are going to see that the tendency for the person to lift the chest unduly with the shoulders going backward in space. It's exactly the opposite of what we want. Yes? So these movements occurring at the movement when the teacher dictates the order, or the conscious guiding orders, necessary to bring about coordination of the different parts of the mechanisms that serve themselves and become primary. That is, the wrong movement become primary when the person use the correct instruction of performance. It's the opposite of what we want. Alexander explains clearly that at first the pupil can get correct instruction of movements and perform incorrect movements as a result. And he says that these incorrect movements hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. And there is something very important here. Well, that is very important to me, is that in this paragraph, we see that the orders or directions of performance are orders of movements. They are not simple orders of movement, they are coordinated movements. So you give a series of orders to coordinate movements. At the same time that you want the hand to reach for the chair, you want the fingers to extend, you want the wrist to rotate, you want the elbow to go away from the hand and from the shoulder at the same time, in such a way as to support the torso. So that when you watch the position of the different object, you will find that the palm is much higher than the elbow, and the elbow is much lower than the shoulder. So you will find a new organization of the movements of the parts, which tend to, in fact, stimulate the serratus anterior action. You don't need to tell the pupil when you do the hands on the back of a chair procedure that it's a procedure that is mainly directed to establish, of course, these coordinated actions that involve the serratus anterior. It's not necessary. But Alexander says, to finish his explanation, he says it's therefore as necessary to order the inhibition of incorrect and unconsciously performed acts as to give orders, conscious guiding orders of performance, which will secure the coordinate use of the mechanism involved. And so to secure the coordinated use of the mechanism involved means to secure the correct movements. And so we are back to this idea that we are interested in muscles in their total working together, how they all work together in order to accomplish the lengthening and widening we want to obtain. So we are back to this fundamental question of what is the lengthening and widening we want to obtain. It's I'm sorry to come back to this, but once again, it's necessary to relate the coordinating principles to the form. It's what are the correct movements? There are movements which promote a certain form in any sort of activity. So let's again have a look. That's a very well-known image. And once again, we see that Alexander is performing a very complex geometrical reaction to having to bring his hands lower to touch, for example, a young subject. And so there are things of interest. We see that the organization of the mechanism of the torso cannot be subconscious, spontaneous. It's absolutely clear that there is a model. Alexander is, at least for himself, following a model. And again, we see that there is a very definite movement that lengthens the lumbar spine, the thoracolumbar spine. It seems that Alexander wants always to get the lumbar spine to be as flat, as large as possible. And there is also above the armpit line, above the middle of the thoracic curve, there is this great hump. Very recently, I had a conversation, a heated conversation with some Alexander teachers, and they object to Alexander's form, to Alexander's model. They consider that this is incorrect, this is abnormal. So to discuss it, yes, it's unusual. You don't see many people nowadays that are capable of organizing the mechanism of the torso to get the head so far forward of the back, so that it may look strange. And so when you compare, for example, I have here taken an image from a Freedom to Move conference in the States in 2014. There is the link, Billy's YouTube link, and you will discover a conference that is led by an English teacher that is well known. It's called Alex Murray. And this is the young Alex Murray performing a ape-like gesture. And so if you compare the model that Alexander is following with his very marked hump forward, you will find that here the head is more than in line with the back. There is nothing in common between these two postures, because the movements that are necessary to obtain the shape Alexander is showing are completely different to the movement that you see here. For me, it is obvious that for the neck column, the spine, the cervical spine, to be as far back, this is absolutely obvious that this person is instructed to unduly lift the front part of the chest. There is no forward and up at all in the cervical spine in this model, according to my calculation. And when you want to calculate, I really mean calculate. That is, I discovered that Alexander organization of the torso was not invented by himself. It was the Delsart system was also promoting something very similar. And to obtain that sort of organization, it was in fact, well, quite simple. You just had to align the bony parts of the front of the torso onto a vertical space, and you would find that, yes, you get exactly what Alexander was seen performing without any help. He was seen performing lengthening of the thoracolumbar region right up to the armpit line, and above it, you get, of course, a hump, because the first ribs are much smaller than the medial ribs. So if you take the middle of the sternum, for example, the lower part of the bony sternum, and set a ruler against it toward the wall, and want to set the top of the sternum exactly the same to touch the wall, but what you will find is that, yes, you get a certain shape. So that shape is particular in the sense that the primary thoracic curve, there are curves in the back, and one is really obvious. It's the primary thoracic curve. It means that the shape of the bones of the vertebrae are such that the plates, if you want to maintain the same length at the front and back of the disc, so that the disc is not squashed either at the front or at the back, then you discover that the spine is not straight, that there is a marked curve. And this marked curve here, in the case of what was called the straight spine model, the straight spine model wants to get the first thoracic vertebrae on a line with the back. of course, this pulls the thoracic spine very much further back than it should, and the head is then, well, stacked behind. This is exactly the model, apparently, that Alex Murray was using on the, November 2014. And this is not something new. I have other pictures of himself and of his wife showing exactly the same organization of the mechanism of the torso. This is deliberate, yes? So I really maintain that Alexander organization of the torso is deliberate, and there are proof that it is. For example, if you, this is a film of the Penn Hill time. It was where the school started. And we see here George Trevelyan, a very tall man. And when you look at George Trevelyan, there is something that is quite obvious, is that his first thoracic vertebrae is not in line with his back. This is, for me, this is clear that when Alexander started training his pupils, he communicated with his hands a certain shape of the torso, yes? And this is very late also film, which is 1951. Alexander is seen manipulating a young Irishman. And so is, well, Alexander right hand is here at the back of the gentleman, and it is absolutely clear that there it's a standard procedure where Alexander is having the pupil lean back in sitting, is taking the person out of balance backward, and he wants to see if the person can maintain the organization of the torso. And it goes with a commentary that Irene Tasker heard Alexander give in a similar occurrence. He said, never let the head overrun the torso in going backward. So you should be able to use the mechanism in such a way and the head is never leading when you go back. Well, of course, you can see that Alexander is having the pupil lead with the top of the middle torso at the height of the lower sternum, and certainly not with the shoulders. Even when the person is falling backward in space, you can see that Alexander makes sure that the shoulders are staying forward. Yes, because when the shoulders stay forward and the ribs are going back, of course, you're making use of the serratus anterior muscle. And you're using, in fact, the mechanism of the arm to lift the ribs instead of collapsing the middle torso backward, as it should when you take the whole weight of a person just from above the armpit line, above the lower part of the sternum. Yes, why is it that the person is not, in fact, collapsing and the ribs going down? Well, there must be some muscles or some fascia, I will come to that, that are stretched and that are pulling in the opposite directions. So, for example, the serratus anterior, the fascia that are part of the connection between the muscles and the bones, they are stretched both ways. It's obvious that when you use the serratus anterior in this way, it's not conscious in the sense of you're not directing activation to the serratus anterior. You're just taking care that the movements are promoting the correct lengthening and widening of the torso, the correct form. So we do not direct muscles to obtain a form, like many students believe. It's the exact opposite. The coordinating principles are such that we direct movements in order to obtain a form. And these forms, we call it position of mechanical advantage, if you want. This position of mechanical advantage, because of the stretch, is going to help lengthen the torso. And because you have to know that this is not the end. Just after this image, Alexander takes the pupil up using the mechanism of the torso, lifting the legs with the muscles of the back. This is a very interesting experience to make. But here we see that Alexander is nowhere directing muscles, directing movements. And what he asks us to perform, and that's what you see here. It's another image of the same gentleman, Trevelyan, but with a different pupil. And you see that he is performing that monkey procedure, yes, that is so necessary to be able to touch with the hands quite lower than the height of the torso in standing. And we see again that it's the same story. He is organizing the movements of the different parts of the torso in order first to maintain his equilibrium, and of course, second, in order to maintain that equilibrium, there is a cause and effect that we see is that he's using the stretch of the back in order to maintain and support the arms and legs with the torso. That's what Alexander called coordinated support. It's something that has been forgotten recently. Alexander always talks about coordinated support, where the torso supports the limbs and, for example, the neck. It's not for the neck to support the torso. It makes no sense because of the mass of the different objects. One of my pupils was objecting, he's a teacher of the Alexander technique, of course, and I explained to him that when you perform a monkey, it's an equilibrium procedure. When you perform going up on the toes, it's an equilibrium procedure too. And the frog dance is an equilibrium procedure. And all these equilibrium procedures can be done with the head set in any sort of position. He could not imagine that the head should not be directing somewhere to maintain the balance of the parts. And that is because he still does not understand what we are after, is that there are wires, there are ropes, they are not only the weights of the parts as if we were a statue made of parts, and it was just a problem of stacking the parts correctly above the ankle. This is a very crude representation. Of course, this is part of the truth of the whole system, of the whole system of guidance, but the system of guidance is mainly based on this idea of finding how to organize the movements of the different parts of the torso so that the passive mechanisms, the passive connective tissues are stretched. And when they are stretched, they authorize some movements that, well, at first will feel absolutely impossible for most people for the simple reason that the person will have the neat impression, the absolute certainty that she's falling. When a person absolutely feels like falling, of course, the person will react in any way she knows, subconscious way, and she will try to release some muscle and try to contract some other muscle in order to maintain stability. The whole problem of the coordinating principles is the whole problem. The first stumbling block, as Alexander calls it, is the person's sensory appreciation. The person has an habitual sense of equilibrium, that is a feeling, somatic impression, and the person believes it is true. The person will tell me, I know my body. I know what I feel. I know I'm falling. How do you want me to go into monkey in this way? Which means what most people do not see when they look at images is that if they were to try to stand and then suddenly release the knee and hip as hinges without releasing the ankle, this is not the habitual way. You will find that modern Alexander teachers, they never go into monkey in this way. They bend the knee by bending the ankle first. And so when I started looking at these images, I started to notice that prior to going into monkey, of course, the teacher was standing next to the pupil. And I started to observe where they were placing their feet. And I found that Trevelyan is not the best of them. Yes, there are others. And of course, the best is Alexander in this case. And the feet are nearly touching. But if you start the habitual procedures to go into monkey, you will find that most people will release the ankle when they release the knee. When they say, well, move the knee as hinges, they have no idea that Alexander is talking about a movement where there is an order of definite inhibition of the release of the ankle, so that the leg, the lower leg, is not stretched at the back, so that the antagonistic pulls at the back are not activated. What we see is that the person is having the back going back relatively to the ankle. And at first, this, for most people, is impossible, because they wear their shoulders very far back, and they have their abdomen protruding forward because their serratus anterior is mostly flaccid all the time. So when suddenly they are asked to get back with the back in space relatively to the ankle, well, they're falling. They just cannot do it. It's impossible. And to have them understand that in order to obtain that movement, you need to have the upper torso come forward. This was an instruction that was used during the first training course. Back, and upper torso come forward. The upper torso come forward is the instruction that produces that sort of movement and stretch of the upper back. There is the widening of the arm. So there is the widening of the shoulders. Therefore, the back is widened. So there is a lengthening and a widening, and it's the exact lengthening and widening we want to obtain. We do not want to obtain the straight back shape. And so the first thing that the pupil that is having lesson of conscious guidance will discover, that the first thing is not directing muscles. The first thing is the re-education of the sensory appreciation, the re-education of the habitual sense of equilibrium, discovering that having so much weight on the back of the foot, because, well, you can imagine the size of that gentleman, well, it was a very tall man, and the size of the gentleman, how much weight is further back than the ankle pivot is great. So there is no thinking of muscle in this. There is thinking of organization of movements. The person feels there is too much weight back, so the person organizes movements forward. So you can have the elbow forward and down. And if you look at the distance between the shoulders and the head, and you compare with modern Alexander teachers that are, in fact, having the shoulders much higher, the shoulders are nearly higher than the top of the sternum. It's a consequence of having the shoulders so far back. In this picture, this lady has the shoulder backward on the same line as the back. I would not consider that this is the proper coordination of movement to expand the thoracic cavity and widen the back. Yes, there is an appearance of lengthening, of course, but this is not, for me, the shape, the lengthening and widening we want to obtain. I hope this is clear. It's the answer to the question, do we think of antagonistic pulls on the muscle? Do we think of activating muscles? No, we do not. And the last reason is because, as you will see later, most of these muscles can be used as fascia. We have this idea of activating muscle and shortening the distance between the insertion and origin. Our idea is completely different. We want to use movements in order to use muscles as fascia, which means that we want to lengthen the muscle. That does not mean that we want to release the muscle. It's completely different. We want to use antagonistic movements without any release of the muscle, which are going to stretch the muscle. And we know these are called lengthening contractions, and these are the most efficient use we can make of muscles. But it's not by working on the activation or by working on directing with the mind the muscles, as if our brain could be bypassed and we could have a direct link with the muscle, which is absolutely, to me, insane, unreasoned, if you want. Yes, and so sorry?
I was going to say, and this also explains why when it comes to analyzing the movements and judging the movements, that you're on the video we use now, or the mirror that they used then, we are looking at the movements of bony parts rather than try to figure out what muscles are doing.
Yes. Well, there is a big difficulty with muscles and with fascia in general, is that they change shape with different length, with different movements. So they are like more amorphous. They are changing so much that it's very difficult to control anything with precision. While with a bone, at the speed we work, it's absolutely clear that the bone is not going to change from the start to the end of a movement that takes 2 seconds. So if you measure that a bone, for example, the shoulder is higher than the sternum when you start and it's slower than the sternum when you stop, well, you can assume that, yes, you have directed the movement of these two bones relatively one to the other. This is possible. This is humanly conceivable. We cannot conceive the exact morphology of muscles and fascia. They are very, very complex. They change in 3 dimensions. And there are teachers that are very happy at the moment to be able to start touching people to get what they call a 3D impression of what they are doing, because they consider that when you watch somebody on a screen, you have a flat image, which is absolutely correct. Yes, and they think that with their hands they have a 3D conception that is of course much more precise than what we do when we control on video, that a person has moved one bone to a certain location, for example, at the same distance to a wall than other parts of the same torso. Sometimes you must understand that wealth of information has nothing to do with precision. Because the teacher is going to get, of course, a form of 3D information by placing hands. What sort of movement is the pupil doing in reaction to certain instructions? Yes, for example, you could imagine using your hands for that. Well, there is a slight problem with this, is that many of the main muscles and fascia, I'm thinking at the moment, for example, of the massive psoas fascia that is working with the serratus anterior to maintain the back lengthening. This is inside the abdomen and inside the pelvis. You cannot touch it. You cannot get your hands on it. It's absolutely impossible. There are some teachers that are saying that they perceive through their hands what's going inside. Yes, it's. I've seen films too of Star Wars, for example, where they have very shiny swords. And they are of the same group, what they call themselves, Jedi, something like this. It looks nice on film. It's very, very interesting. And the story is powerful. Yes, but when you come down to earth and you start to understand how complex the system is, how do you want a person with hands to feel inside another person with any sort of precision, any sort of accuracy? These are just ideas. They are nice ideas. They make nice stories, but they don't make technique. Technique cannot be made of such phantasmagories, of such crazy thinking. So for the moment, we have a very crude technique where you think that, yes, if you see a series of movements that is producing a position of mechanical advantage, you can be quite certain that the conditions of the fascia and muscles are appropriate. You cannot think the movements of muscles. You cannot think the direction of the opposite part of a muscle, especially like the serratus anterior. It's a very funny situation that the person asked me what I thought about insertion and origin. Well, this muscle has no less than 10 fascicles. So it's 20 origins, 20 points you have to think about if you really want to direct the muscle. I defy anyone to be able to think so many movements, so many spots at the same time.
It's far too small a level to be working with, the level of the muscles.
Yeah.
But it all comes back to feeling, because you can feel the muscles, so people get pulled into dealing with the muscles because that's what they feel.
Yeah.
Rather than reasoning and what you can see based on a video or images.
Yeah.
But you can't
and
feel.
So it's very interesting that nowadays people are objecting to video, to lesson on video, and the fact that Alexander always come back to mirrors. It's something you see. Are you lengthening the back? Are you not? Are you widening? Are you directing the upper chest upward, forward and upward, or not? If you're directing it back to make a straight spine, it's obvious. You can see it. Yes, it's easy. It's no big deal. It's just a matter of looking at what is happening. And you can only imagine that Alexander used mirrors in this way. It's completely unbelievable to imagine that Alexander had such a mind that he could direct the insertion and origin of his 700 muscles. No way. It makes no sense.
Okay, thank you, Jeando.
You're
We'll
welcome.
leave it here today. For people watching the video, you can find a link to Jeando's websites underneath if you would like to book a lesson with him. And we will see everybody in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.